And the first trend that I'd really like to dive into, and one that we've been talking about quite a bit at PurpleSec, is automation of vulnerability management processes. And so many organizations are turning to these tools and processes to streamline their vulnerability management efforts. Includes use of machine learning algorithms to identify and prioritize vulnerabilities, automating processes for patching, remediation, and so much more. And Joshua, I want to start off by throwing this question over to you. Is automation all that it's cracked up to be, or is it just vendors talking the talk? And where do you see automation evolving, from here to support vulnerability management programs?
I think it's a bit of both. There's absolute value in automation across the board, whether it's automating your scans, doing your discoveries, finding out what vulnerabilities you have, and then immediately switching that into the kind of reactive mode of automatically patching those devices. Having a process that allows you to kind of automatically test your patching in a test environment and immediately roll that in once you've confirmed that it's good into your production environment. Some of us are, everyone has a test environment. Some of us are lucky enough to have a production environment too. That's kind of the way of the beast at a lot of places. So having the ability to kind of do a lot of those things automatically, using automation, using, all the tools that we have out there, using some AI stuff, machine learning, allows you to kind of just reduce your, footprint that is exploitable. We have all the hacks that have gone on, and, we'll talk like the Experian hack. The vulnerability that they used was months and months old. It was not, a, patch Tuesday, exploit Wednesday scenario. It was this was patch Tuesday 6 months ago that it absolutely could have been patched, but really they didn't have processes in place nor automation that says, this is what I have, these are my vulnerabilities, and this is the tool I'm going to use to fix that in a repeatable fashion.
Believe it or not, people still get hit with struts exploits
Yeah.
today. Like they still have that vulnerability. And you've really hit a key thing, right? It's like, how long are you vulnerable for? And I think a lot of organizations kind of, I don't know if they forget about it. I'm not really sure what it is that leads to these giant holes in in their vulnerability management, where they're months behind on updates that can be exploited. I know before, intelligence was a lot of thing, and I think one of the cool things about our automation tools, and especially just the fact that our, all of our people here really care about security and like to research it, is it's very quick with the information. Like we knew about Log4j the day it was released, and we were able to deploy patches to our customers the day they were available, or at least alert them that there was something to patch, right? So, in your experience, what do you think leads to that gap, right? Like we have the intelligence, the tools, and the experts to identify problems as they happen, but then organizations seem to fail to react to them as quickly as we would all like them to.
So I'm going to piggyback off of what you just talked about was Log4j. It's now over a year later, and there's still a massive amount of exploitable Log4j out in the wild. And
Has it
the
been that
real,
long? Wow.
Yeah, it's been that long.
Woo.
And kind of the thing that was really highlighted by Log4j was that organizations didn't realize they had it.
Yeah.
It was embedded in, 3 layers deep in their product line. They don't know they have it. Organizations have largely done a really poor job at developing what their asset lists are. What are my critical applications? What are my critical hardware pieces? What are my critical software? Where are they? And where does that kind of define what my vulnerability is? I can have the same vulnerability that's a, CVE that's rated as a critical. And if that's on my perimeter edge on a web server, that's a different level of vulnerability than sitting on a air gap system inside my network that you have to have physical access to get to. I'm like, yes, they're both ranked as a critical, but which one do I really need to pay attention to? And that requires you to understand what you have, where it's at, and what business processes are tied to that. So kind of having that matrix is what a lot of organizations just are really weak on. They do basic asset-based discovery scans. I did Tenable for loads of years. I've used Qualys and some of the other tools. And if you're doing asset list discovery and scanning, you're missing, half your network. You've got shadow IT, you have stuff that, you don't necessarily realize that they're on your network. All of the OT, IoT things that are kind of there that creep on over time that if you're not doing true, full IP space discovery scans that take forever, you're going to have these gaps in knowledge. And those gaps in knowledge create massive amounts of vulnerabilities.
So that right there is what we aim to close with automation, right? Mean time to remediation is something that we've talked about before. Jason and I have, that's kind of that's the measure of that gap, right? Like we know there's a vulnerability. How quickly can you remediate it? Because here's a very real statistic is it takes on average less than a day for vulnerabilities to be weaponized upon discovery. And to be deployed, especially now with like botnets as a service, you can weaponize and deploy something the day that it's dropped on, on 0 day or day +1. So now, that's going up against these organizations like Experian who took months to patch something. And, they're obviously a lot better today, but even being a month behind is still too long. If they can weaponize things in hours, we have to start thinking about closing those gaps within days and weeks now, not months.
Yeah,
And I think a lot of orgs still do monthly.
Yeah, and when you really factor in the factor of mean time to detection currently is 7 months.
Is it really? Wow,
Wow.
that's that bad.
It is that bad. So
how is that possible?
Well, you have no patching, not necessarily have your SOC related tools set up to identify those things. They could be going in and doing kind of those very stealth level actions that,
right.
You aren't going to ping because you have a large amount of data flowing out. They're just moving laterally throughout your network. So the stat is 7 months. That's huge. If they weaponize day 2 and you're 7 months before you even detect it, that's like even with a fairly robust patching schedule where you're patching once a month, they're in your network for at least a month at the minimum before you actually do anything to prevent them from being there. And typically you're not going to know that they're there for several months after that.
Right, the stealth's getting better, and if it's something like an APT, I mean, then we're talking you may never discover it until your data is ransomed. Another thing you mentioned earlier was the criticality of these vulnerabilities, and something that I've been noticing and been trying to change is the fact that criticality is one of like the top 3 statistics or metrics right now that people are looking at when they're talking about vulnerability management. And you mentioned it, the risk to the organization. The risk-based approach is something that I really like because I don't really think the critical rating matters. Like, for example, here's a penetration test I did, right? They had a level 1.0, a low, right? It was SMB message signing is disabled. Now, we here probably already know where this story is going to end, and probably a lot of people listening do too, but we were able to take that low level vulnerability, combine that with a medium SMB endpoint, no validation. And then in this environment, there was no EPP or EDR to prevent writing malicious payloads to the disk, right? And then we were able to do some super low level snooping, found some remote control channels, validated some local credentials, but then combined all that together. And at the end of this, I was able to hook malware into their Active Directory, connect back to our test C2 server and, make a ping, and then send a dummy file back the other way. So, this is a ransomware is what happened. So organizations who are focused on this, oh, well, that's a low vulnerability. We don't need to patch that for another 9 months, right? Well, that's fun tools for people like me.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of those things where if you kind of follow what is kind of the DoD methodology where you're supposed to patch criticals within 15 days, high within 30, mediums within, 6 months, so on and so forth, you end up getting a lot of these really exploitable, mediums and lows that by themselves aren't terribly bad, but when you have enough of them, you can leverage them against each other. And then one of the really kind of interesting things that attackers are using now, particularly for ransomware, is using legitimate tools that already exist on the box. Things like AnyDesk, where you already have this remote access software sitting on your desk, or they're deploying legitimate remote access software that your
Bomb
EDRs,
guard.
XDRs aren't going to flag as naughty and something that is going to be blocked. They're going to say, no, this is legitimately this software. Go ahead and install it. And now I've used all these kind of small, kind of innocuous vulnerabilities to now get a legitimate foothold in a network where I have the ability to kind of just spread everywhere I want.